Every morning, Judge Evelyn Carrington stepped into this courthouse, embodying what many believe to be the highest ideals of justice. She was sharp, respected, and revered by her peers. The courtroom was her domain, a place where her rulings could alter lives. But as we take you deeper into her story, you'll find that the scales of her own life were far from balanced. Evelyn had been on the bench for over a decade, known for her commanding presence and a reputation that spoke of fairness and integrity. Outside the courtroom, she wore the guise of a devoted wife to Daniel Carrington, a decorated police officer with over 20 years of service. Together, they seemed like the picture of respectability, a couple dedicated to protecting and upholding the law. But not everything in the Carrington household was as harmonious as it appeared. Beneath the polished veneer of their professional lives was a marriage strained by distance and mounting resentments. Evelyn's role as a judge demanded long hours and grueling cases. Daniel, often on patrol or at precinct meetings, worked late nights. Their schedules rarely aligned, leaving their once-loving partnership fractured by time and indifference. As they drifted further apart, Evelyn sought refuge in an unlikely place. Months earlier, Evelyn had presided over the sentencing of a man named Marcus Delaney, a repeat offender convicted of fraud. At first glance, Marcus was nothing more than a name in a case file, a criminal in her courtroom. But that perception shifted when his words during sentencing caught her attention. Marcus claimed he was more than his crimes. He spoke of redemption, of second chances. It was a sentiment Evelyn had heard countless times before, but something about his delivery stayed with her. After his sentencing, Marcus wrote her a letter from prison. One of many, it turned out. What began as formal correspondence gradually turned personal. Over the following months, their communication deepened. To those on the outside, Evelyn remained the composed judge, focused on her career. But in the privacy of her home, her relationship with Marcus grew into something neither of them could have anticipated. For Evelyn, Marcus represented a freedom she hadn't known in years. He was daring, charismatic, and unafraid to challenge her in ways no one else dared. She began to believe his words, perhaps too much. But relationships like these don't stay hidden forever. Daniel was no stranger to suspicion, and his instincts told him something wasn't right. He had noticed the change in Evelyn. Her late nights, her distant demeanor, her quick dismissal of questions about her day. Despite his doubts, Daniel's trust in his wife kept him from prying too deeply. What he didn't realize was that the bond between Evelyn and Marcus had already begun to cross dangerous lines. Evelyn's life was diverging into two distinct worlds, one governed by laws and order, and another dictated by emotion and secrecy. And it was only a matter of time before the two collided in ways no one could have predicted. And just as quickly as the letters began, they set into motion a sequence of events that would destroy lives and leave a community reeling. Before we continue, did you know that over 80% of our viewers haven't subscribed to the channel? If you're enjoying this story, please consider supporting us by hitting the subscribe button and turning on notifications. Your support helps us bring you more compelling true crime stories like this one. And don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. It wasn't long before Evelyn's clandestine relationship with Marcus began to consume her. Letters turned into phone calls turned into visits, and as the bond between them deepened, so did the risks she was willing to take to keep him in her life. But Marcus wasn't just a man looking for redemption. He was a man with needs, desires, and demands. And Evelyn was about to learn the cost of keeping him satisfied. Marcus had always been a man with a silver tongue, someone who could charm his way out of almost anything. Behind bars, he wielded this gift to manipulate those around him. He wasn't just a convict. He was a strategist, someone who knew how to identify weaknesses and exploit them. Evelyn's need for connection became his greatest advantage. As Marcus painted vivid pictures of the life they could build together once he was free, Evelyn began to see her husband, Daniel, as an obstacle. Marcus fueled her growing discontent, planting seeds of doubt and resentment that only widened the rift in her marriage. At first, it was subtle. Marcus questioned why Evelyn stayed in a marriage that made her unhappy. He spoke of his admiration for her strength, her independence, qualities he claimed her husband didn't appreciate. And Evelyn, feeling increasingly isolated in her personal life, began to internalize these doubts. She started to view Daniel not as a partner, but as a barrier to the happiness Marcus promised her. But words weren't enough for Marcus. He wanted more. He wanted freedom, money, a future with Evelyn, and he made it clear that Daniel's presence made all of that impossible. It was during one of their late-night phone calls that the idea was first mentioned. Marcus, careful with his phrasing, floated the possibility of removing Daniel from the picture altogether. It was subtle, almost as though he was testing her reaction. Evelyn didn't dismiss it outright. She hesitated, considering the unthinkable. From that moment on, their conversations took on a darker tone. Marcus laid out his vision of their future, a future that couldn't exist with Daniel in the way. He spoke of sacrifice, of how love sometimes demanded hard choices. And Evelyn, caught in the throes of her emotions, began to see his logic. She started to believe that this wasn't just a choice for Marcus, but a necessary step for her own happiness. Evelyn's transformation from respected judge to someone contemplating murder was gradual but deliberate. She began to research ways to make Marcus's suggestion a reality. She sought out contacts, people she had encountered during her years in the legal system, individuals with questionable morals and the ability to operate under the radar. Among those contacts was a man named Travis Morgan, a former informant turned small-time criminal. Evelyn knew Travis was no stranger to dirty work. His reputation as someone who could handle delicate matters quietly made him the perfect candidate for the job. Through coded conversations and careful meetings, Evelyn proposed the plan to Travis. She framed it as a necessity, a way to escape an unhappy marriage and finally pursue the life she deserved. At first, Travis hesitated. He wasn't one to get involved in high-profile situations, especially not when they involved someone as visible as a police officer's wife. But Evelyn's persistence, along with a sizable payment, eventually won him over. With Travis on board, the plan began to take shape. Evelyn provided him with detailed information about Daniel's routines, when he left for work, when he returned home, and even which roads he preferred to drive. Her knowledge of law enforcement operations allowed her to ensure there would be minimal risk of interference. As the pieces fell into place, Evelyn's demeanor began to shift. Those closest to her noticed the change, a newfound determination, a sense of purpose that seemed almost unnatural. Daniel, too, picked up on it. He asked questions, probing gently, but Evelyn always had an answer ready. She'd become adept at deflecting suspicion, a skill honed from years on the bench. By the time the date for the hit was set, Evelyn had convinced herself that this was the only way forward. She rationalized her actions, framing them as a necessary evil to secure her future. But what she didn't realize was that the very people she had trusted to execute her plan were already faltering in their loyalty. Travis, for all his bravado, was in over his head. The weight of targeting a police officer, a man with connections and resources, was more than he had anticipated. And as the day approached, he began to doubt his ability to follow through. What Evelyn saw as confidence was, in reality, a thinly veiled panic that threatened to unravel everything. Unbeknownst to Evelyn, her carefully laid plans were beginning to crack. The hitman she'd hired, the partner she placed her trust in, and the vision she'd built with Marcus, all of it was balancing on a knife's edge. And the consequences of even the smallest misstep would prove devastating. The morning of the planned hit arrived like any other. Daniel left their home at the usual hour, his routine unchanged. Evelyn, meanwhile, spent the early hours meticulously rehearsing the alibi she'd crafted. Every detail of her day was accounted for, every possible question answered. In her mind, this was just another calculated move in a life that demanded precision. Yet, the air was thick with tension. Unspoken doubts lingered between Evelyn and Travis, and while both outwardly maintained their composure, the cracks in their plan were already beginning to show. Travis had agreed to the job, but he hadn't been able to shake the unease gnawing at him. The risk was too high, the stakes too personal, and his confidence too fragile. On this particular morning, he hesitated. Rather than carrying out the hit as planned, Travis made a call, one that Evelyn would never have anticipated. Whether motivated by self-preservation, guilt, or fear, Travis decided to confide in an associate, someone he believed could provide him with a way out. What he didn't know was that this associate had their own connections to law enforcement, and the information would not stay contained for long. As the hours passed, Evelyn went about her day with a carefully rehearsed sense of normalcy. She attended meetings, presided over cases, and even shared polite small talk with colleagues. To the outside world, she was the same composed and capable judge. But beneath the surface, she was awaiting news that would forever alter her life. The first sign that something was wrong came in the form of a phone call, one that didn't go as expected. Instead of confirmation that the plan had been carried out, Evelyn was met with Travis's erratic voice, filled with uncertainty and panic. He confessed that the job hadn't gone according to plan, his words rambling and fragmented, leaving Evelyn struggling to piece together the truth. In that moment, Evelyn's carefully constructed facade began to falter. Her mind raced through the possibilities, the potential for exposure, the devastating fallout if her involvement was revealed. She tried to contain her frustration, urging Travis to stay calm and reminding him of the consequences if they were discovered. But what Evelyn didn't know was that Daniel had already begun to suspect something was amiss. His instincts, honed by years on the force, told him that Evelyn's recent behavior wasn't just the result of a strained marriage. He had noticed the subtle changes in her demeanor, the hushed phone calls, the late nights spent in her office. And now, with his life on the line, those suspicions would come to the forefront. While Evelyn scrambled to regain control, Daniel's colleagues in law enforcement received an anonymous tip. The information was vague but alarming, pointing to a potential plot against one of their own. The tip included enough specifics to warrant immediate attention, and an investigation was quietly launched. Daniel, unaware of the full extent of the threat, was brought in for questioning about any possible enemies or recent conflicts. By the time Evelyn realized the investigation was underway, it was too late to backtrack. Travis, now fully consumed by fear, had gone silent, cutting off communication entirely. The associate he had confided in had already passed along the details of the plot, and law enforcement was closing in on the key players. The walls were closing in faster than Evelyn could anticipate. Detectives began piecing together the timeline, cross-referencing Travis's accounts with phone records and surveillance footage. The evidence painted a damning picture, a web of deceit that led directly to Evelyn. Her calls to Travis, her visits to Marcus, her increasingly erratic behavior. All of it pointed to her role as the mastermind behind the plot. Evelyn, once so confident in her ability to control the narrative, found herself ensnared in the very system she had spent her career navigating. Her attempts to redirect suspicion were met with skepticism, and her reputation as a judge now worked against her. The very people she had worked alongside were now tasked with unraveling her scheme. The pivotal moment came when law enforcement confronted Marcus in prison. Initially defiant, Marcus eventually broke under pressure, revealing key details that confirmed Evelyn's involvement. His words, once used to charm and manipulate, now sealed her fate. Investigators were left with no doubt about the extent of her betrayal, not only to her husband, but to the principles she had sworn to uphold. As the evidence mounted, Evelyn's options dwindled. The woman who had once commanded respect and authority now found herself at the mercy of a system that would not bend to her influence. And as the truth came to light, the impact of her actions would ripple far beyond her own life, leaving a community to grapple with the shocking reality of what she had done. The courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the back rows, their cameras clicking as Evelyn Carrington, the once revered judge, entered the very setting where she had presided for years. This time, she wasn't seated at the bench. She was the accused, and her fate lay in the hands of a jury. The prosecution wasted no time in painting a vivid picture of Evelyn's betrayal, not just of her husband, but of the judicial system itself. Their opening statement was sharp and deliberate, outlining how a woman entrusted with the law had used her knowledge to plan a crime so calculated and so devastating that it shocked even the most seasoned investigators. The state's case hinged on a mountain of evidence: phone records, financial transactions, and, most damningly, the testimony of Marcus Delaney and Travis Morgan. Both men, facing their own legal troubles, took the stand to recount the chilling details of Evelyn's plan. Marcus, who had once been her confidant and lover, described how their relationship had evolved from flirtation to conspiracy. His testimony was clear and unflinching, his words laying bare the extent of Evelyn's desperation. "She told me she wanted a fresh start," Marcus said, his voice steady as he addressed the courtroom. "She wanted to be with me, but she couldn't do that with her husband in the way. She was the one who brought up the idea. I didn't force her into anything." Travis's testimony was equally damaging. Although his guilt was evident, he detailed how Evelyn had recruited him, provided him with information about Daniel's routines, and promised him a hefty payout. His nervous demeanor only added to the tension in the room as he described the moment he decided he couldn't go through with it. "I thought I could handle it," he admitted, "but when it came down to it, I knew I'd made a mistake. I couldn't take a man's life." Throughout the trial, Evelyn sat quietly, her expression unreadable. Her defense team attempted to portray her as a victim of manipulation, of circumstance, of a failing marriage that had pushed her to the brink. They argued that Marcus, with his charm and cunning, had preyed on Evelyn's vulnerabilities, convincing her to take part in a plan she didn't fully understand. But the prosecution countered with brutal efficiency, using Evelyn's own actions to dismantle the narrative of victimhood. They presented emails and text messages, showing her clear involvement and intent. They highlighted her meetings with Travis, the financial transactions she had authorized, and the deliberate steps she had taken to cover her tracks. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when the prosecution played a recorded phone call between Evelyn and Marcus. The conversation, obtained through prison surveillance, captured Evelyn speaking candidly about the plan. Her tone was calm, almost businesslike, as she discussed the logistics of the hit. The jury listened intently, the weight of her words settling over the room like a heavy cloud. As the trial progressed, the public's fascination with the case grew. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered daily, holding signs and shouting opinions on Evelyn's guilt or innocence. For many, the case was a symbol of betrayal, not just of one man, but of an entire community's trust. How could someone who had devoted her life to justice fall so far? The defense called only a handful of witnesses, attempting to humanize Evelyn and present her as a woman who had made a terrible mistake under extraordinary circumstances. They emphasized her years of service, her dedication to her career, and her strained marriage to Daniel. But it was clear that their arguments struggled to counter the overwhelming evidence presented by the prosecution. Daniel Carrington, the victim of the plot and Evelyn's estranged husband, took the stand in a moment of raw emotion. His voice cracked as he described the betrayal he felt, not just as a husband, but as someone who had devoted his life to protecting others. "I trusted her," he said, his eyes fixed on Evelyn. "I trusted her with my life, and she tried to take it away." His testimony left a profound impact, not just on the jury, but on everyone in the courtroom. The closing arguments brought the trial to a fever pitch. The prosecution implored the jury to consider the facts, to see Evelyn for what she was, a woman who had used her position of power to orchestrate a crime for her own selfish gain. The defense, in turn, pleaded for understanding, asking the jury to consider the pressures Evelyn had faced and the influence Marcus had wielded over her. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. As the forepersons stood to deliver their decision, the room fell silent. The words echoed through the courtroom, guilty on all counts. Evelyn Carrington, once a symbol of justice and authority, was now a convicted criminal. The judge, a colleague she had once worked alongside, sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Evelyn's reaction was stoic. She nodded slightly as the sentence was read, her face betraying no emotion. But as she was led away in handcuffs, her shoulders slumped slightly, a small but telling sign of the weight she now carried. The trial had come to an end, but the questions it raised lingered. How could someone so dedicated to justice be capable of such betrayal? Was Evelyn truly a victim of manipulation, or had her own ambitions and desires led her down this path? The answers, like much of her story, remain complex and unsettling. The courtroom was empty now, its rows of seats no longer filled with reporters, lawyers, and curious spectators. The case of Evelyn Carrington had officially ended, but the ripples of her actions continued to spread, leaving behind a community grappling with the fallout. Daniel Carrington, the man whose life had been at the center of Evelyn's plot, returned to his work as a police officer. But things were far from normal. His colleagues treated him with a mix of sympathy and unease, unsure of how to navigate the delicate line between supporting him and acknowledging the betrayal he had endured. For Daniel, every day carried a reminder of the woman he once loved and the danger he had narrowly escaped. In interviews following the trial, Daniel spoke candidly about the emotional toll the ordeal had taken on him. "I've seen a lot in my years on the force," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "But nothing could have prepared me for this. The person I trusted most in the world tried to destroy me. It's something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life." Evelyn's sentencing marked the end of her career, but for many, it also symbolized the collapse of an image they had long admired. Those who had worked alongside her were left to reconcile the judge they had known with the criminal she had become. Former colleagues described the shock of her actions, with some struggling to believe she had been capable of such deceit. "She was one of the best," one attorney said. "I still don't understand how it all went so wrong." Meanwhile, Marcus Delaney, whose relationship with Evelyn had set the plot into motion, faced his own legal consequences. His testimony during the trial had earned him a reduced sentence, but he remained behind bars, his once grand promises to Evelyn reduced to empty words. Marcus became a symbol of manipulation and betrayal, his role in the case serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked influence. For Travis Morgan, the would-be hitman, the aftermath was a mix of relief and regret. His cooperation with law enforcement had spared him a harsher sentence, but his involvement in the plot left a stain he could never fully erase. In interviews, he spoke of his fear and guilt, describing how he had been drawn into a situation he never should have agreed to. "I'll never forgive myself for the part one played," he admitted, "but I'm just glad no one got hurt in the end." The case also left a lasting impact on the legal community in Alabama. Evelyn's actions sparked conversations about the pressures judges face and the ethical boundaries they must navigate. For some, her story became a cautionary tale, a reminder that even those entrusted with the law are not immune to its consequences. Beyond the legal world, the case reverberated throughout the community. Residents of the town where Evelyn and Daniel had lived grappled with the knowledge that someone they had admired had been capable of such betrayal. For many, the trial became a symbol of the dangers of unchecked ambition and the consequences of letting personal desires overtake moral responsibility. In the years that followed, Evelyn's name faded from headlines, but not from memory. Her story continued to serve as a topic of discussion, debated by legal experts, journalists, and true crime enthusiasts alike. Some viewed her as a victim of manipulation, others as a cold, calculated criminal. But for all the opinions and analysis, one thing remained clear. Evelyn Carrington's actions had left an indelible mark. And what of Evelyn herself? Behind the walls of a maximum security prison, she lived out her days in relative obscurity. Her legal expertise, once a tool of justice, was now used to help other inmates navigate the system she had once controlled. In rare interviews, she spoke of regret but stopped short of taking full responsibility for her actions. "I made mistakes," she said, "but I never intended for things to go as far as they did." For some, her words rang hollow, a final attempt to rewrite her legacy. In the end, the story of Evelyn Carrington is one of profound complexity. It's a story of love turned obsession, trust turned betrayal, and ambition turned downfall. It's a reminder that even those who appear untouchable can fall, and that the consequences of their actions can ripple far beyond what they ever intended. As we close this chapter, we invite you to reflect on the lessons of this case and the questions it raises about justice, morality, and the choices we make. And if you found this story as compelling as we have, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the world of true crime.